Hey guys, and welcome back for another video. I am so excited to talk to you guys tonight about what is one of my favorite things I read this year. Like, obviously at the end of the year, I will make a very tidy top 10 list and we'll talk about all the books that were awesome because there have been a lot of awesome books. But as of right now, like guys, it's September and I read these in June and I still think about them every day. So as of right now, it's definitely easily one of my favorite things I read all year, and it is the Warlord Chronicles by Bernard Cornwell. And it is a trilogy. It's 3 books, The Winter King being first, followed by Enemy of God, and the last one is titled Excalibur. So if you can tell by the titles at all, this is a spin on the Arthurian legend. And it is what is categorized as historical fiction. So I am going to, from the get-go, I'm going to tell you, I'm going to link a couple videos below that honestly do a better job reviewing the books, telling you what they're about without spoiling them for you in a true review format. But what I want to do is just tell you what I liked about them, how they made me feel, and like who I would recommend them to. And just gush. Like, you're going to hear me go, oh, they were just so good. Probably like 5 or 6 times because I just like them so much. So here we go. So first of all, why did I pick these books up? Like, what did I hear about them? What hooked me and made me buy them and commit time to making them a priority on my TBR? Because we all know there's so many books, so little time. So what is it that made this series crack my TBR? And honestly, it was hype. So I am very active on Mike's Discord, and it seemed like everyone on his Discord was going crazy for these books. And Bernard Cornwell in general, like, we joke around, we call him Corn Dog, especially all of us who have never read him. And Corn Dog, by the way, is not slander. That is not a jab. That is not making fun of him. Corn dogs are delicious. So first of all, let's get that out of the way. But old Corn Dog was getting quite a reputation on the server, and everyone was talking about these books. So Mike decided to read them, and he read them at the beginning of June. And he loved them. And so then I was like, okay, like the whole server is reading these. Everyone is liking them. There are several people who are like the official, leaders of his fan club. And now people I know personally are reading them and actually enjoying them. So it definitely brought it to the forefront for me and made me prioritize it. But also, it's an Arthur story. And I'm not married to the Arthurian legend. I have not read like a bunch of other Arthur books. I'm not super familiar with the original Thomas Mallory, version of the story, other than like watching Sword in the Stone when I was a kid and just being generally aware of the gist of the story because it's kind of common knowledge. Like, everyone knows about Excalibur and Lancelot and the Round Table and Merlin, and like we all know, right? So I was already kind of hooked. Like, okay, let's see what kind of spin they're putting on this well-known legend. And then finally, Bernard Cornwell, he wrote The Last Kingdom. And I'm a big fan of that show. I still haven't caught up on the last season, but everything I've seen so far on that show really won me over. And I can tell that he's somebody that really, really appreciates historical accuracy and the details. And that means a lot to me. Like, that'll get you a long way with me. So it's already my favorite time period, medieval England. And the author has already, won me over as far as him writing a story. So, and, sculpting characters and like building a narrative. I was already sold by what he does, but just in a different medium. So when I heard that this was a trilogy, like, that's pretty intriguing because the Last Kingdom, those are books too, but there's like 100 of them or something. I mean, not really, but it's a big commitment. There's a lot of books in that series, and this is a trilogy, and trilogies are just so yummy. You can eat them up real quick, and then you have a sense of accomplishment because you're done and you finish the whole series. So all of that combined, I was in. I was ready. So next up is, what is it about? I already mentioned that it is a spin on the Arthurian legend, but this is what makes it different. It is told from the perspective of not Arthur, not Lancelot, none of these, not Merlin, none of these people, these characters that we know, but it is told from one of his warlords, Durfel. And it's just so clever how it's put together. So this is first person retrospective. So Durfel at this point is an old man, and he has gone from being one of the most, notorious warlords in all of England to he's a monk now. He is old and he's a Christian monk. And he is retelling the story of Arthur from his perspective as a bystander. So as, for a lot of his life, he was Arthur's right-hand man, but they're leading war campaigns and they're all over the place. So they weren't together all the time. So he's retelling this whole story from his perspective. And the way he's telling it, he's like, this isn't a story, because there are stories about Arthur at this point in his, where he's at as an old man. There are stories, there are legends, there are, poets and bards and songs about Arthur. And like I said, the Knights of the Round Table and Merlin and Lancelot and Excalibur, the Great Sword. There are these stories that are already considered like common knowledge as he's an old man. But he's telling us the story that we know, the story that we all know and love, that has come to be truth, history as you would. It's not accurate. And he's like, I'm okay with that, because people want a romanticized version. They want something where the hero is the hero and the princess is beautiful and there's romance and there's adventures, and people want that, and that's okay, I get it. But I'm going to write down and tell you the real version, because it's not quite as glamorous as legend would have it. And I am obsessed with this concept that history isn't always written by the victor. Like, we hear that a lot, and there's truth to that. History is written by the victor. History is written by he who pays the bards. History is really written by he who keeps company with the poets and the people who are writing the songs and writing the legends. And there's a lot of stylization that goes into that to make it intriguing to the common man. So I just love this twist on it, that he's like, yes, there's a story. And Arthur, yes, I knew him, but if you'd like, I could tell you the real story. I loved this concept, and it just really, really, really worked for me. So how did this series make me feel? That's important to me. Like I said, I don't ever feel the need to try to recap the plot in a non-spoiler way, because first of all, if you need that, like I said, there are better videos than mine that do that. And also, all of these books have a back cover. They have a synopsis on Google. You can check that out and get like the basics if you want, at your own risk. But what I want to know when someone gives me a recommendation is like, how did it make you feel? Like, what did you like about it? What did it do for you? So I'm just gonna, I wrote some things down, and these are old notes. I wrote these like as I was reading it. So, how did it make me feel? Honestly, so surprised. I don't know what I was expecting, but this series wasn't what I was expecting. It was better. Like I've already said, it's gonna be an all-timer for me. I liked it so much. So I felt really surprised, because I hoped I was going to like it, but I didn't know that it was going to hit all the right notes for me, and it definitely did. Like I said, Durfel is an old man at this point, and so it really does read like a grandpa telling you a story. Like, have you ever met somebody who's just an amazing storyteller? And even though it's just an old man telling you a story, you could sit there and listen to him talk for hours and hours. That's what I got from this. And it definitely helped me that the audiobook narrator like fit those shoes perfectly. And I'll talk more about that at the end. But I know plenty of people who read this eyes only with no audio involved, and they agreed with me that it felt like someone who's just a master at telling stories sitting down and, giving you the privilege of listening to their stories. So I really like that vibe in anything I read, and this one just did it so well. This book will take you through all the emotions when it comes to the characters. I didn't expect the character work to be so strong in this, because it does take a minute to get you there with the characters. I mean, not too long, but it takes you a minute to like figure out who everybody is, where everybody is, and just get connected with everybody. And when it does, not everybody is likable or good or somebody you want to root for. Like from the very get-go, you're like, okay, when does this person die? Because I don't like them at all. And it shows some awesome redemption arcs. Like redemption arcs that I never thought I would be on board with. By the end, I'm like, this is what it is to be a human, you guys. Like, sometimes humans are terrible, but sometimes humans earn redemption, and it's so good when it's done well. And this book has some awesome redemption arcs. It also touches on brotherhood. Like, I love a band of brothers. I love a group of people that were put together to basically die, and then they band together and overcome the odds. Like, I'm a fan of that type of trope anytime when it's done really well. And this has that, but it always feels authentic and realistic. So it definitely has that loyalty and brotherhood, and like, because, these armies, we're used to seeing, 80,000 Dothraki or something. These were basically what we would call skirmishes. Like, in modern fantasy and even in modern warfare and stuff, like, these were small numbers. And he does such a great job of historically showing you that, if you had 120 men, like, that was a force to be reckoned with, because there were just less people back then, and they were much more spread out, and they were basically still tribes and clans and stuff. And I love this medieval Dark Ages time period, and you can tell that Bernard Cornwell put so much care into it and thought, and like, he's obviously somebody that respects history, because historical fiction is his genre. And I don't think you get to be famous or popular or well known in the historical fiction genre if you don't respect history. So I loved the slice of life stuff where you see what it was just really like to live in that time period. And some people in the beginning, especially, I think that's hard for you to get past, because there is a lot of just like what it was like to live in this time period. But I particularly really liked that. So I felt like the history was really respected. And it just made me feel really proud, because these people have sworn an oath. And you're going to hear a lot about oath making and oath keeping, and what oaths really, really meant to people back then, because it wasn't just a promise. Like, they believed that there was eternal consequences to being an oath breaker. And so you get to see these men struggling with the idea of, I made an oath, and, my heart tells me, my brain tells me that this is not somebody I should be supporting, but my word is on this, and that meant something. And I just really love all the cultural stuff that is brought into this. So the feels were there. Speaking of feels, you're going to go on a roller coaster of emotions. Like, I cried so many times in this book, and I don't mean like boo-hoo-hoo, like, that's just not how I cry when I read books. But when it starts to like make your tight throat and like your eyes just get a little leaky, so many times. And it's not all because of sadness. Like, there were so many times it was because of victories, big or small, because of personal things with family and children and just loved ones, and connections that were, soulmates. Like, this book has soulmates. It has romance. It has so many. It's just a book about life. Like, this is the Warlord Chronicles, and it is a lot about battles and skirmishes and war. But this is a book about a man's life, and it was done so well. It gave me all the feels. So what did I love about the series? Like, as you can already tell, I loved almost everything about it. Specifically, though, historical fiction is new to me. I have not read much historical fiction. And as someone who reads primarily fantasy, I loved that this book was historical fiction that was written for the fantasy reader. So this book contains Merlin, which many think of Merlin as a wizard, but Merlin was a druid. And, the druids were more about gods and religion, and, his goal was to bring the old gods back to earth, because he felt like, the Christians were taking over, and that was after Rome had already conquered and stuff like that. So these really old tribes and clans that had gods that they worshipped, and all these rituals and stuff like that was becoming antiquated and old. And so Merlin was about bringing the old gods back. And so what a lot of people who were eyewitnesses, they, you know, they revered it as magic. And we, as fantasy readers, we're going to want to call it magic as well, because there are ancient artifacts, and there are quests, and there are grails, and there are, you know, rituals and stuff like that done. And it feels like magic when you're reading it, but really it's not magic. It is more like religious lore. So it's a perfect segue for a fantasy reader. So that's what I personally loved about it. I loved the unique storytelling perspective, like I already mentioned. First person retrospective is not necessarily unique, but this idea that history as we know it, I mean, this was a long time ago. So far back that the lines blur between history and legend, history and lore. And so this perspective of saying, you know, so far, like, this is considered how it was, this is history, this is the story, you know it, but it could have gone this way. Because here's a perspective, like here's someone telling you his version of the story. And it just makes you go, like, all these things that were so far back that we view them now. Yeah, it's history. Like, we know stuff from like biblical times and Roman, you know, when Rome was an empire. We view it as history because it did happen, but what version of it? You know, it's so far removed. And we know after, especially after reading this, it's a great reminder that it's really just all about the perspective of whoever was holding the quill, you know, who was writing it down. And it opens up so many cool conversations, and I just love this unique perspective at which it's told. I'm just going through my notes because I don't want to miss anything awesome. If you are a fan of action and fighting and battle scenes, you're going to love this. But even more importantly, if you're not a fan of fighting, battles, duels, action, war, all that kind of stuff, because surprisingly to me, there are a lot of people who kind of skim that stuff. They're not super into it. This is the Warlord Chronicles, so there's going to be a lot of fighting, like, naturally, but I feel like the way it's written is so good that anyone is going to be on board with it. Like, whether you dig that stuff or whether you kind of tend to avoid that stuff, I think you're going to love it in here. Because it's written, I don't know, it's just like, I can't even put my finger on what makes it different, but the way he writes it is so simple. A lot of battles weren't really that long. A lot of times they were over before they really started. He talks about the way it smells, the way it sounded, like how scared he was. And it's more about the battle from his perspective. And I just thought it was so good. So definitely check it out for that alone, if nothing else. Amazing women characters. Modern fantasy has gotten a lot better about this, but still sometimes I read women written, and maybe men do it too when a woman tries to write a man, but sometimes I read women characters and I'm like, have you even ever met a woman? Like, let's just be honest. Like, that's not how women talk, that's how they think. Some of the women characters in this are some of the best I've ever written. Like I said, there are love stories in here, but there are also stories of just hideous people that betray and make awful choices and just continue to throw people under the bus. And you're like, why do you still like her? But like I said, there's redemption arcs, and just the way it's written, it just feels so human and so understandable that despicable things can still be seen from both perspectives and go, you know what? Like, I hate that she did that, but I do understand. I just love how realistic and believable all these characters are written. All of them, but especially the women. It's just nice to see. All right, what I didn't love about these books. I'm really trying to be fair. I'm trying not to gush, but there isn't much that I didn't like. Bernard Cornwell himself said that of all the books I've written, these are my favorites. So I guess that's something that's kind of disappointing for me, is that I do want to read more Corn Dog. I want to read The Last Kingdom. I have another series back there that I'm not 100% sure what it even is, but I bought it because it was a good deal. And I know some people on the server are going to be reading it soon. So I thought, what the heck? I'm sold. I'm in. But I am a little worried that maybe it all goes downhill from here. Like, maybe this is a one-hit wonder for him. I kind of doubt it because I feel like people love The Last Kingdom as well. But that's something that I'm like, well, maybe I kind of started off with the greatest hits and set myself up for some disappointment. Okay, so as far as things I didn't like, I did this almost 100% on audio. So it wasn't an issue for me. But I do know that a lot of people, I don't want to say complain, but I think they struggle with the names and the places. Because not only are there a lot, but they are the way they are written and the way they are spelled is very, very antiquated, and it's hard to understand. So like when I was listening, I felt like I was understanding and tracking all the characters and the names. About halfway through the first book, I was like, okay, like I'm totally, I got my footing, and I understand what's going on. I understand who's who, where they're from, what kingdom they represent. I got out a map of like, super old England and Britain and all of that, and kind of like got my footing, and I got on board pretty quick. But people who were reading it physically were complaining a little bit, and I like really dove into the book, and I was like, oh, I get it. Like these names, there's some names that have like no vowels. That would be really hard when you're reading it. Like it's some of those names that you look at and you just go, I'm just gonna make up a blurred up N name, and that's what I'm gonna call that person, because they're like impossible to pronounce when you look at them. Again, I listen to an audio, so I have pronunciations in my head, but I look at it and I'm like, you got that pronunciation out of that spelling? I have no idea how. So that can be difficult. It can be tough for immersion, I'm sure. Like I said, I know some people kind of struggle getting into the first book because maybe the first third of it is a little slow, especially when you pick it up and someone sold it to you by saying like, oh, it's a story about Arthur and Lancelot and Excalibur and the Knights of the Round Table. And you get into it and you're like, there's no Arthur, there's no Merlin, there's no Excalibur, there's no Knights of the Round Table. Like that could be frustrating if that was how it was sold to you. But remember, this is Durfel's story, and they're on war campaigns and all kinds of stuff. So he's not with Arthur all the time. Like Merlin is MIA for most of this first book. So if you go into it expecting straight Arthur, you're going to be disappointed because it is Durfel's story. So that could be a complaint for some as well. As far as the audiobook goes, I mentioned before that the audiobook was excellent. I want to just like beat that point for a minute. It was so good, like S tier. It was just read by Jonathan Keeble, and the audio was immaculate. Like some of the best I've ever listened to, maybe. Like that's a bold statement. I might need to make a list. I have made a audiobook tier list before. It's well overdue for me to redo that video because I've listened to so many audiobooks since then and discovered so many new narrators that I'm obsessed with. But like this is S tier, you guys. This is some of the best I've ever listened to. It absolutely just like captured my attention and would not let me go. Like it sounded like a grandpa reading the story, but at the same time, the voices he did were good, but not over the top with the voices, but more than anything, it's like when it was emotional, his voice was emotional. When it was intense, his voice got intense. Like when it was supposed to be, like he just really respected the source material and played into it. Like all the emotions you're supposed to feel when you're experiencing the story, he sold it with his performance. So I cannot recommend these audiobooks enough. The first one is on Scribd, if you guys subscribe to that, but do watch out because there are some abridged versions out there hanging out. Don't get those. Like you'll know what they are because they're like really, really short, like a couple of hours. Do not get the abridged versions. That's absolutely insane. Nobody should listen to or read abridged versions of novels. But anyway, absolutely check them out. The last question I always ask myself is, who is this book for? Like, who would I recommend it to? And I'm going to say fantasy fans. Like, if you are a fantasy reader who wants to branch out and try new genres, you've been thinking about historical fiction, do this one because it reads like a fantasy book and it has what we're going to feel like are fantasy elements, even though it's all historical fiction. So definitely recommend this for fantasy readers. I recommend it for anybody who loves and respects a solid audiobook because, like I said just a second ago, Jonathan Keeble is an all-star, rock star. And for people who just really need for things to be historically accurate, you can tell that the author respected history and really did his research before he was reading it. So I want to read you guys just the first paragraph because I also think this is a great recommendation for someone who loves prose that is simple yet beautiful, like gripping, but he doesn't need to be fancy or overdo it, but somehow he's still able to paint a picture and capture your attention without it being like, poetry or like way too much description. Like somehow it's just a perfect balance between simple and like really elegant. So I'm just gonna read this real quick, and I read this before I recorded and it automatically made me want to do a reread. So I will leave you guys with just a small reading. Once upon a time, in a land that was called Britain, these things happened. First of all, I love that because it's establishing that this is the real story. Like there's stories out there, but this is the one that's real. So once upon a time, in a land that was called Britain, these things happened. Bishop Sansom, who God must bless above all the saints living and dead, says these memories should be cast into a bottomless pit with all the other filth of fallen mankind. For these are the tales of the last day before the great darkness descended on the light of our Lord Jesus Christ. These are the tales of the land of Holgir, which means the lost lands, the country that was once ours, but which our enemies now call England. These are the tales of Arthur, the warlord, the king that never was, the enemy of God, and may the living Christ and Bishop Sansom forgive me, the best man I ever knew. How I have wept for Arthur. I want to reread it immediately. So that's all I have, you guys. I hope you can make sense of this video because I'm just gushing, but guys, it's so good. Please read it. And if you have, or when you do, let's chat because I can't stop thinking about these books and I want to talk about them with anyone who will listen.